August 2nd, 2008. Two men stood high on K2. The mountain climbers call it the Savage One. One of them would be dead within hours. The other would tell the world what happened. Two friends stood where few humans ever have. By nightfall, one would be gone. The other would tell a story the world would believe for years. A story that wasn't true. Because up here, truth dies slower than people do. But years later, new evidence suggested something far darker. That the truth of what happened on K2 that day might be nothing like the story Marco told. Did a hero die saving lives? Or did a survivor lie about what really happened up there? This is the story of the K2 climber who lied about his friend's death and the secret that has haunted the mountain ever since. Welcome to the Extreme Edge. Marco Confortola liked to say he was born in the mountains, that the thin air of Valfurva, Italy was the first thing he ever breathed. And honestly, the story fit him perfectly. The image of a boy raised among glaciers, destined for the heights, was a story the newspapers loved. He grew up watching his father tie knots and read snow the way others read books. Guiding was in the family blood. And by the time Marco was a teenager, he was determined to follow in his father's footsteps. He would later boast that he became a certified mountain guide at 18, one of the youngest ever to earn the coveted UIAGM IFMGA badge. Earning that badge was no simple task. Candidates were thrown into the Alps for days of draining tests. They practiced crevasse rescues in blizzards, navigation drills in whiteouts, and knowingly stayed in temporary camps called bivouacs on exposed ridges. Most came back with frostbitten fingers and haunted eyes. Others failed terribly, and when Marco made it out, he passed by a margin so thin that even his instructors were surprised. That narrow victory became the foundation of a legend. By his 20s, he had joined the Alpine Rescue Service of Lombardy. These are the men who go up when everyone else is coming down, the ones who climb toward disaster. It was a very difficult job, the kind where you arrive at the avalanche too late, where victory means carrying a body back intact. Marco claimed to have climbed Grand Zebru nearly 300 times, enough to know every crack by name. The figure sounded impossible, but in that valley, no one argued out loud. Whispers said he counted helicopter rescues among those ascents, but Marco couldn't care less. He continued to build his identity there, on repetition and risk. Soon enough, the Alps had become too familiar and perhaps too small for Marco. The great drama of high-altitude life was happening elsewhere, in the Himalayas, and he knew he had to share in the thrills. So, in the early 2000s, Marco began to go on high-altitude expeditions in the Himalayas, but none of them made the news like his announcement to climb Everest in 2004. Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you'd like to be part of the Extreme community, see exclusive videos made just for you, get early access to our other content, and vote on content polls. Come join us on Patreon. See you there. Marco Confortola's ascent of Everest began on the Tibetan Plateau, already at a lung-crushing altitude of over 17,000 feet. The first major hurdle was the North Col, a wall of ice rising to about 23,300 feet. Here, Marco and his team would hammer their crampons into the blue ice, ascending fixed ropes up this 1,000-foot headwall, all while exposed to the constant threat of ice collapses from above. Once above the col, the real test began on the northeast ridge. As he continued his ascent past Camp 1, Marco would have spent hours navigating this rocky spine, moving from Camp 2 at around 24,750 feet toward the infamous 3 steps between 27,500 and 28,000 feet. On the second step, there's a vertical rock cliff nearly 100 feet high at around 28,140 feet. This is where the famous Chinese ladder is fixed. Imagine dragging your exhausted body, starved of oxygen, up a near vertical ladder at an altitude where jets fly. The physical and mental effort required is almost unimaginable. After clearing the third step, the final challenge was the summit ridge itself. This is a long, deceptive traverse that seems to go on forever above 28,500 feet. Each step in the thin air requires a massive effort of will. When Marco finally stood on the summit at 29,032 feet, he had achieved a remarkable feat. The greatest danger on the north side is the extended time spent in the death zone. Descending the second step using a doubled rope wrapped around the body and fixed at a higher point is technically even more demanding than ascending it. Fatigue, dehydration, and hypoxia set in, turning simple tasks into life-or-death struggles. By the time he returned to Italy, newspapers ran his story with pride, but Marco wasn't done. He announced that he had done it without supplemental oxygen, and the claim sparked doubt among members of the climbing community. There were no independent witnesses near the top and no photographs showing his summit. Some who had shared base camp said he looked far too fresh afterwards for a man who had gone oxygenless. Marco never responded, but 2 years later, in 2006, he made his way to Annapurna, where he joined Silvio Mondinelli. This was a step in his pursuit of all 14 26,000-foot summits. When Marco retells the story of his Annapurna summit, he tells about how epic the climb was through falling rocks and physical exhaustion, and how he and Silvio made it to the top together. But as some in the Italian mountaineering community recalled, the details never quite aligned. According to expedition notes, the pair stopped at a 4 summit, roughly 40 minutes below the true top. While Silvio pushed on alone, Marco was too tired to continue and had waited behind. But when the story reached home, that small detail had vanished from Marco's narrative. He told the story again and again, his eyes unfocused, as if watching a film only he could see. By 2008, when Marco arrived at the base of K2, another peak he had to cross off his list of 14 26,000-foot summits, he had no idea how his fate was about to intertwine with an engineer, Gerald McDonald. Engineers are typically found working in research facilities, corporate environments, or consulting firms. So what was this engineer doing on high-altitude peaks? Irishman Gerald McDonald was a 27-year-old engineer when he moved across continents to icy Alaska. Jer, as his friends called him, would tell anyone that he had traveled to Alaska in 1998 for better job opportunities. Still, around that time, Ireland was going through something called the Celtic Tiger Boom, a period of rapid economic growth in Ireland that transformed the country from one of Europe's poorer states into one of its wealthiest. The truth is, it was the Alaskan peaks that truly called for him. Over the next 5 years, Jer had transformed from the proper city man who had never climbed a mountain to a highly experienced climber who already had his sights set on Mount Everest. The most striking change about Jer was the beard. It was no longer a carefully groomed beard of a city man, but a wild and thick growth that covered his jaw and cheeks. It was this very beard, combined with a deep kindness that never left his eyes, that led his fellow climbers to nickname him Jesus. In 2003, he joined an Irish expedition aiming for the summit of Mount Everest. Among his team was his fellow climber Mick Murphy. After his dedicated years of practice in the Alaska range, Jer was ready for the greater ranges of the Himalayas. The climb was a classic Everest expedition via the South Col route in Nepal. The team had to go through a long process of slowly adjusting their bodies to function in the oxygen-starved air above 26,000 feet, known as the death zone. The physical toll it takes on climbers can be a lot, and in Jer's own words, he struggled deeply, having to deal with the thin air and the brutal cold on the mountain. Yet, within this struggle, Jer's spirit shone through. While others might have become withdrawn or singularly focused, Jer became the heart of the expedition. He was the one who would lighten the mood in a tense camp, and if he wasn't sharing a story, then he was serenading the camp with music. So, what made his summit success stand out? Well, it wasn't just that he reached to the top on May 26, 2003, it was how he did it and what it meant to him. His summit day was a brutal test of endurance. After a final push from the high camp at the South Col, Jer and his teammates achieved their goal. He stood on the summit of the world, looking out at a view few will ever see. But for a deeply thoughtful man like Jer, the summit was more than a tick on a list. While others were overwhelmed by the feeling of victory, Jer was overwhelmed with gratitude for the people who helped him achieve it, the Sherpa climbers. It was a rare perspective in a world where summits were considered personal victories, but that was the kind of man Jer was. As always, the descent was a fight against exhaustion, but Jer returned to base camp safely. As an Everester, he was now a member of one of the world's most exclusive clubs. Yet, the certificate and the title were not what he cherished most. He carried back with him a belief in teamwork, a respect for the mountain environment, and a confidence that he could operate at the very extremes of human endurance. Everest was the confirmation. It answered the question of whether he had the physical and mental fortitude for the highest peaks, but in doing so, it inevitably raised another, more dangerous one. What's next? In 2006, Gerald climbed Broad Peak, where he excelled, reaching the summit before anyone else on the team. But that was just a warm-up for him. His main target was the K2. So as soon as he descended from Broad Peak, Gerald made his way to the base camp of K2. What is it about K2 that called on Gerald? Why would a man who had stood on the top of the world on Everest risk everything for this particular peak? Well, for Gerald, K2 was the ultimate test. For every 4 people who have reached its summit, 1 person has died trying. That statistic goes to show how difficult it can be to climb this savage mountain. Climbers have to deal with the unpredictable weather and the constant danger from falling chunks of ice and rock. It's also so complex that one wrong step could be the end. He was now so high on the mountain, breathing in the thin air that comes with extreme altitude, when something terrible happened. A large rock broke off the mountain and was coming fast at Gerald. How can a climber prepare for the unpredictable? They wear protective gear and make sure to have any supplies. Gerald was fully protected, even wearing a climbing helmet. As he watched the rock headed for him, he knew in his guts that the force was going to hurt him. Yet, he couldn't help but hope his helmet would minimize the damage. When the rock finally hit Gerald, it didn't just crush his helmet, it smashed directly into his skull, leaving him instantly stranded at extreme altitude levels with a severe head injury. Gerald needed a hospital within an hour, otherwise he was going to die. Mick Murphy and Banjo Bannon, Gerald's teammates, had watched the entire tragic scene play out. In that moment, they became Gerald's lifeline, his only chance at survival. At first, they tried to help him descend, but getting down on your own is hard enough on K2. Time was running out, and it soon became obvious that they needed a helicopter. Helicopter evacuations are really risky at such an altitude, but with shaking hands, they immediately called for backup. Soon, the sound of raging helicopter blades penetrated the environment. Against all odds, Gerald was successfully taken from the mountain and rushed to a hospital, where he received care immediately. The physical healing took weeks, first in Pakistan, and then back home in Alaska. But what about the psychological impact? For many, such a close brush with death would be a definitive end to the dream. But once more, Gerald revealed his different mindset. He told his fellow climber, Alan Arnett, that instead of breaking him, the accident motivated him. He couldn't wait to head back again. Now, was this a true example of the resilience of a true mountaineer, or the beginning of a fatal obsession? Barely 2 years later, Gerald was once again staring at the mountain that had once broken his body. His spirit, however, stayed high. No way he was going to back down unless he stood on its summit. The 2008 season saw several international teams on the mountain, including a Dutch team, a South Korean team, a Norwegian team, and independent climbers like Italy's Marco Confortola. The teams agreed to cooperate on fixing ropes for a safe ascent. It was during the long periods of acclimatization and waiting for a good weather window that Gerald McDonald and Marco Confortola met and became friends. For a brief moment, 2 very different men found themselves roped together on the same path. Life at high altitude is brutally hard, and having someone with Gerald's positive, brightening presence made a significant difference. The summit push began on August 1st, 2008. It was a scene of dozens of people rushing out with their gear and checking out the fixed ropes until someone noticed something wrong. The ropes were not fixed. The consequence was a deadly bottleneck of climbers, forced to wait as the precious, limited hours of daylight bled away. One by one, they inched upward, and from a sky view, they looked like a line of fireflies crawling up a hill. It was here that Gerald climbed back into his own past. 2 years earlier, this very ice had been painted red with his own blood. Now, as his crampons bit into the slope, did he feel a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature? Did every scrape of ice against rope sound like the beginning of another avalanche in his mind? Was his heart beating a familiar rhythm against his ribs to the memory of his body being torn and broken? Well, if it did, Gerald didn't show it. Marco can only recall an ever-smiling man, more concerned with the well-being of the other climbers. Eventually, on that Friday night, August 1st, 2008, both Marco Confortola and Gerald McDonald stood on the summit of K2. For the experienced Marco, it was a monumental addition to his long list of climbing achievements, a key milestone for any professional high-altitude guide and mountaineer. But for Ger, it was a profound personal victory, a confirmation that he could conquer the mountain he had almost died on. They took pictures, grinning tiredly at their cameras, but the celebration was soon cut short. It was getting dark already, and a threatening cold wind began to claw at their exposed skin. And with every second they spent celebrating, the precious air in their oxygen tanks continued to run out. They had to leave. It was on their way down that things began to take a dangerous turn. In the unreliable section known as the bottleneck, a massive block of ice the size of a building collapsed without warning. The icefall swept away climbers and, most critically, severed the fixed ropes that were the lifeline for those still above. This left at least 17 climbers stranded, including Ger and Marco. They had barely made any progress descending. The fixed ropes were gone, and it was too dark for them to even try fixing anything. There was only one choice. They had to wait for daybreak, and that meant spending a night above 28,000 feet without shelter. Right there in the open, Marco desperately dug 2 small holes in the snow so he and Ger could camp for the night. They remained there with the hope that by dawn, their limbs wouldn't be too frostbitten to work. The next morning, both men moved out of their holes, exhausted and frostbitten, but deeply grateful. They had survived the night. The worst had happened. What more could go wrong? As they struggled to descend, they saw a tangle of ropes just below. 3 men were trapped within it. These were climbers from the Korean team, Hyo-gyung Kim, Jumik Boat, and Pasang Boat. It was a cruel sight. Some were hanging upside down, their heavy packs pulling them into inverted positions, and their limbs were twisted in the cords. At least 2 of them were no longer moving, their bodies stilled by the cold and the thin air. To make matters worse, they were not on a safe ledge, they were on a steep traverse. A single slip here would send a person thousands of feet down the face of the bottleneck. Gerald McDonald and Marco Confortola stopped. They had just survived a night in the death zone. Their own survival depended on a quick descent. Yet, they could not walk past. For 3 hours, Ger and Marco worked hard to free the men. Their frozen fingers fumbled with knots, and their ice axes chipped at the frozen ropes. They pulled and pushed, trying to free the unconscious men. Yet, as much as they tried, their efforts seemed useless. And this is where the story enters its morally disputed chapter. At this point, Marco was completely spent and had reached his limit. He looked at his friend, Ger, still trying hard to save the men. But to Marco, the trapped climbers were beyond saving, and if he stayed, he was afraid to end up just like them. Marco and Ger agreed they'd descend together. That was the plan. They'd done what they could. It was time to save themselves. But when Marco began moving down the slope, Ger didn't follow. At first, Marco assumed his friend was right behind him. The fog was thick, visibility poor, and their radio contact was fading. But when he looked back, Ger was gone, still up there, somewhere near the bodies tangled in rope. That was the last time Marco saw him alive. Hours later, Marco reached the lower part of the bottleneck alone. His oxygen was gone, his feet were freezing, and every step felt like walking on knives. He barely made it to Camp 4, where rescuers later found him frostbitten and delirious. When the reporters came, he gave them a story. According to Marco, Ger had made a noble choice. He decided to stay behind to help 3 trapped climbers, and that was how he died. The narrative spread fast, the Irishman who sacrificed himself to save others. It was beautiful, tragic, and it made headlines all over the world. But in the days that followed, other versions of the story began to surface, and they didn't match Marco's version. Some climbers at lower camps said they'd seen Ger alive long after the time Marco claimed he died. Others insisted that Ger had continued helping injured climbers even after Marco descended, and that a second Sirach collapse later swept him away. That's where the story begins to fracture. When Marco was asked later to clarify what happened, his answers shifted. In one interview, he said Ger had fallen. In another, he said Ger was frozen where he stood. In yet another, he claimed he never saw Ger again after the first collapse. His tone changed depending on who asked, and every retelling left new gaps. But when the cameras started rolling, Marco's version of events began to harden into something else, a story he could live with. In his press conference at Milan airport, Marco Confortola told reporters he had stayed behind for 3 to 4 hours trying to help the trapped Korean climbers, saying, "It was something that just came from my heart. It was after that I paid the consequences." But the camera Gerald McDonald had handed to Pemba Gyalje Sherpa before their summit told a different story. The photos later became key evidence suggesting it was Gerald, not Marco, who had remained behind to help. Even the rescue logs conflicted with what Marco described. While he told the world Gerald was already dead, satellite data and other climbers' testimonies suggested Gerald was still alive for hours, possibly helping others, while Marco made his descent. Why did Marco's story keep changing? Was it trauma clouding his memory, or something more deliberate, an attempt to control the narrative before the truth caught up? It's not hard to imagine the pressure he faced. He was the only surviving professional guide on the mountain that day. Questions would naturally point toward him. Did he leave his friend behind to save himself, or did he truly believe Gerald was gone? Those questions have never been answered. Even in Con Moriarty's reflective piece, the tone is careful, respectful of Gerald's legacy, but aware of how vague and contradictory Marco's statements were. Moriarty never accuses him directly, but his inclusion of reports criticizing climbers for declaring others dead too soon feels pointed. What we know for sure is this: Gerald McDonald was last seen alive near the fallen climbers, still trying to help, moments before another serac collapsed. His body was later found higher on the slope than expected, evidence that he had stayed behind, not fallen. So the question remains, did Marco truly not know what happened to his friend? Or did he choose silence over the unbearable truth, that in the chaos of K2, he descended while Gerald stayed to die? Either way, only one of them made it down. And ever since that day, Marco's story has never fully matched the mountain's silence. But what do you think really happened to Gerald that day? And why did Marco's recollections match? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.